Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. For those of us of a certain age, the protests, demonstrations, and revolutions we are witnessing in New York and around the world today remind us of the 1960s and 70s. Whether we demonstrated against the Vietnam War, the greed of capitalists, racism in its many forms, or the lack of equality for women, and whether or not we agree with the tactics that are being used by today's protesters, we can relate to the emotions these events evoke. And probably none of us more so than today's guest, Linda Coleman. Raised in a wealthy and privileged family on Long Island, she rejected its values to join forces with a revolutionary group that believed violence in the pursuit of social justice was necessary. Her memoir, Radical Dissent, The Cultivation of an American Revolutionary, has just been published by the Pushcart Press imprint of W.W. Norton Company. Welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl.
As I said, you were raised in a very privileged atmosphere. Tell me about your family background.
My early years were, the community that we lived in was on the South Shore of Long Island, and it was a very small enclave of a WASP community, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, all those families. And then it was very nearby, it was in the 5 towns, and so very nearby there was a much larger Jewish community and then an African-American community in Inwood. It was very poor. So my mother, who was sort of an activist in her own right, but in a different era, did a lot of work in Inwood, helping to form a community house, and did a blood drive there as well. And anyway, so I think that was sort of an early imprint for me on the inequities that surrounded us in having this exclusive life of private school, private clubs, private beach club, and feeling like there was this whole world around us that was living very differently.
By the time you took up with the revolutionary group that you write about in your book, you were already becoming radicalized. Where did that happen? Was it in college? Was it from the books that you read? Where did that come from?
I think it evolves sort of slow, gradually. I went to boarding school, which I really did not like. I was very unhappy there. And another friend of mine and I graduated a year early by the good graces of an English teacher who figured it out for us. And her father was stationed over in Umbaban, Swaziland, and she invited me to come and spend a year there with her. And I think that was also a tremendous shift for me, because again, I saw how another whole part of the planet lived, and I felt very embraced by the people that I worked with there, and they were extremely poor. And so when I came back from Africa, I went to Hampshire College, and there I started to study Marxism and socialism. I had some radical professors, but Hampshire was very small and isolated and exclusive in its own way. So I felt by the end of my 3rd year there, I also inherited money as a result of what happened when we turned 21. And the combination of the inherited wealth and my exploration of Marxism and all of the experiences I'd been having with people who were of very different means in life, I think it sort of all led me in that direction. So
you seem to be feeling a lot of revulsion at the lifestyle that you had been brought up in.
Oh, to this day, you mean? No.
Well, at the time, certainly at the time that you joined with the group.
At that time, I felt like it wasn't so much. I felt like there was a lot of hypocrisy in my family, and that they were espousing a certain sense of that our system allowed opportunity for anybody, and really it didn't seem to provide opportunity for many. That it depended on what family you were born into, what kind of clothes you wore, what kind of color skin you had, whether you had a trust fund in your account. There were just a lot of restrictions on who actually got to be in that class and in that group. So.
And you were already feeling anger about the fact that we were involved in Vietnam, and by how Governor Rockefeller broke the
Yeah.
the prison uprising at Attica.
Yes. Yeah.
These
yeah.
seem to have been things that had already radicalized you.
Well, when I got to Maine, that's really when I became exposed to a lot more of that sort of information. I don't think I was very naive when I got to Maine, and when I walked into that bookstore, I walked in because there was a leaflet on the door that was protesting a police death squad that was in Portland at the time. There were 4 policemen, one in particular who was pretty much of a psychopath, who had decided that he was going to assassinate a number of undesirables in the radical community there and bury their bodies. I think it was around the Beltway that was going to be laid in the city at that point.
And this was real? The cops
This
were
was real.
actually convicted?
So this was real. So here's the young idealistic girl who's already become somewhat radicalized and thinking about how evil the system is, and that policemen are out to only protect the white rich folks. And
You're in Portland, Maine. You're studying to be a nurse, and you run across this radical bookstore and the people who are in it. Describe the people who work there and what drew you to them.
Well, like I say in my book, there was no social register on the coffee table of any of those people. There were ex-convicts, and the 2 of the people, well, the one who was sort of the ringleader of that group and had been the most involved in activism in the state of Maine at that point, had gone to Vietnam as a very patriotic Marine. I think he was in the Marines.
This is Roland.
This is Roland in the book. And had been politicized in Vietnam by seeing what we were actually doing over there. And when he came back, it became more of an activist in terms of highlighting some of what the Americans' government was doing in Vietnam. And he got picked up for having a very small, like a 1/4 ounce of marijuana, and put in jail. And as an activist in jail, he was given a 5-year sentence, most of which time he spent in solitary. So by the time he got out of jail, he was even more radicalized. And then when he went back to Maine, where he was from, he started an organization called the Statewide Correctional Alliance for Reform, SCAR, which was about addressing the needs of people in the prison system who were being abused at that point. And
so you start working at the bookstore and attending a study group that the group members run.
Right.
What was it that the members of this group wanted to accomplish?
Well, I think they wanted to, there was a lot of rhetoric at that point. I think there was a lot of revolutionary rhetoric that was becoming really the norm in the left at that point, because I think...
I remember a lot of it,
okay,
right.
So we wanted to break the chains. We wanted to have freedom for all. We wanted to have equality. We wanted to have socialism. We wanted to change the system radically. And so, and you had to choose which side you were on. And that was a lot of what was very impressive to me. You always were confronted with this question of, are you on the side of what's right or what's easy? And if you were on the side that was right, then you would stick with this radical this radical rhetoric became very impressive to me, I think.
You say that the males that you met in the group, Roland and Devin and Sam and others, were the first real men that you had ever met. That most of the guys you'd met up to then seemed like boys in comparison.
Well, I think these men had, they were older for one, about 10 years older than I was, and the men that I'd been associated with in college and so forth. But they, had been hardened by a lot of the hard knocks of growing up either poor and in families that were very poor, and like Roland's family worked in shoe factories, and his mother worked 2 jobs, his father worked 3, and same with other family. Joe's family, the woman in the book that I talk about a lot, her family was also from very poor working class backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they were very attuned to and then they had been both in jail and in Vietnam two of them. So
they were
I
very
think they're
attuned to
very
inequality,
yes,
and justice.
and to a lot of violence, violence of the system as well as violence of war. So.
It seemed like a pivotal moment for you was when Jo, one of the women who worked at the bookstore, was raped. She was raped inside the bookstore, and the bookstore was vandalized. And that seemed to have been, was this the moment when you became more committed to their cause?
I think it's difficult to separate. I mean, I was both, horrified by the whole attack on the bookstore. Of course, I found Jo. It was very traumatic for me. She's a friend of mine. I wasn't that close to her at that point. I didn't know her that well. But all these events drew us much closer, much more quickly. So in some ways, it became difficult to separate politics and social and friendship.
Right.
So, and I think that is always difficult. Yeah.
Now, right after the rape, supposedly for your own protection, the men in the group lent you a gun.
Yes.
And what was it like? A nice private school girl from Long Island having a gun in your house.
Well, this attack on the bookstore was pretty terrifying. They were men who claimed to be from the Ku Klux Klan. We had no idea if these police that were being identified as wanting to get rid of radicals, if they were involved. So we didn't really feel comfortable going to the police. So when and there was a note in the bookstore that I found, because I was the one who came in when Mary had just been raped. I mean, Jo had just been raped, and it said, we're going to get all of the women. And so get out of town, sign the KKK. So I did feel like getting a gun was some form of both a step towards being a revolutionary as well as taking on something that I might need. I was I traveled at early morning in the darkness to the hospital. I was in parking lots. I lived by myself. I didn't have anybody watching out for me. So they were watching out for me. I felt like they were really treating me. Again, I was sort of taken into a group, and in a way, a new family. And I think that was one of the themes in this book for me, is like how we look for groups or family in our lives, and they were.
Was this, at that time, were these the fiercest friendships that you had up until that point?
I'd had very good friends, but I think I felt estranged from my family of origin at that point, and I think I was, maybe not consciously at that point, but I think I was looking for another family identification, and they were a clan. I felt I had a sense of people who were really watching out for each other, who really stood up and showed up for each other, and I didn't really feel that way about some of the people that I'd grown up with. So.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more with Linda Coleman, author of Radical Dissent, The Cultivation of an American Revolutionary, in just a moment. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Linda Coleman, author of Radical Dissent, The Cultivation of an American Revolutionary. It's just been published by the Pushcart Press imprint of W.W. Norton Company. So as time goes by, your role in the group's activities expands. You lend Benny, he's a guy who you wrote to when he was in prison. He gets out, comes back. You lend him your gun to, quote, do a job. After Roland and Sam arrested with a carload of guns and some armored car routes in their possession, after they are sent to jail, you start cashing out the stock portfolio that your father's given you. You put up $4,000 cash bail for Harlan. You wind up quitting your nursing program, moving out of your apartment, and basically hitting the road with Jo. In Denver, you put down $3,000 for a lawyer for Harlan, $1,500 for a rented house. You put up $4,000 bail for Roland's bail. Did you ever feel at the time that you were being exploited or used by these people for your money?
I didn't. I felt like that money didn't really belong to me, and that was the big conflict that I had, that the discussion I was always having inside myself was, this money doesn't really belong to you. This money was made off of the
backs of the
backs
oppressed.
of the oppressed, and so it really belongs back in the hands of people who want to change the system to make it more fair and equal, and meet the needs of people who have been oppressed by it.
So after you have really committed, quit your nursing studies, gone off with Joe, started giving money to the group, how did you explain your action to your parents, and what was their response?
I was out of touch with them for large periods of time, but I did have some phone contact occasionally. It was very difficult for me to talk to them. I didn't really want to go into a lot of detail about what was happening, and I don't think they really wanted to know, actually. And so I did at one point have a letter exchange where I wrote out a lot of my feelings about what I was doing, and where they didn't know anything about the rape or the attack on the bookstore, for instance, or that I was carrying a gun, or that I was with people who had a violent past and were asking me to buy more weapons for them. So, but I was just talking about my politics at that point, and we disagreed, and so. Now, when I read back on those letters, I see a lot more as a mother now with two older sons, and knowing how hard it is to change things in the system. I see a lot more of their point of view in a more reasonable way, I think, than I did at that time.
Right. Throughout the book, you talk about the contradictory feelings you had. For example, while you were looking through Sam's big black book. Now, by this time, you have learned that Sam is a fugitive from justice, and he has a big black book of bad guys, presumably the kinds of people the group are going to take actions against. And you realize, looking at these bad guys, that they're like a lot of the people that you knew, that you grew up with, like your own family and their friends. That must have been
very well. I think that was very much a turning point in a way, that I started to feel the connection to violence against people that I actually knew, and that and then understanding that as I've grown older, violence against anybody, there's always somebody on the other side who is a mother, a father, a brother, a son, or whatever. So I started to turn away from the idea of violence being a viable form of protest.
Even after seeing that book, you get more deeply involved. Roland asks you to buy him a gun, and you buy him a .347 Magnum. Harlan asks you to pay the balance that's due to his defense attorney, which you do. You write a check for $40,000. But then you decide to leave the group and go back to Portland and to the nursing program if they'll have you back. And those actions seem contradictory.
I left at that juncture because I really didn't feel like I was doing anything that was really other than glorified babysitting at that point. Joe had two young children I was very fond of, but I felt that the children were sort of stabilized in their life now. They'd been through a big transition. Father was back at home. Everything was sort of stabilized there, and I wasn't really doing that much. I wasn't involved in anything in particular.
Okay.
I still felt like Roland and I had parted in this difficult way, where he had sort of accused me of not really being willing to support the revolutionary actions that he was going towards, setting up.
That you were turning rich girl on him.
That I was turning rich on him. So I went back. At that point, I really didn't know where to go, and so I ended up thinking I'll go back to Portland, and I had a feeling that group was going to reconvene in that area, and that maybe they would contact me and I might have the chance to redeem myself from having gone rich.
And in fact, you do. You're back in Portland, back in the nursing program, but they pop up again, and you're asked to drive one of the cars, the second car, in a bank robbery that the group is planning, and you agree to do that. Did it ever occur to you that someone might get killed?
Well, I live every day. I think that's a lot of why I wrote this book. I had to get close to what happened to this girl, what motivated her to get so close to killing or harming herself or another human, and living and causing so much harm to my people who love me and cared about me. And so, yes, I did think about it then, but I felt like I was so caught up in the dynamic and the rhetoric of the revolutionary cadre that I had to, in order to really be accepted into that fold, or to hold true to my revolutionary ideals, that I had to
Step up.
Step up. This
Okay.
was the time. Are you going to do it, or are you going to, wimp out?
Okay. So the robbery goes off without a hitch. Boy, were you lucky. And afterwards, you drive Roland, who participated in the robbery, to Boston. You later agree to drive a load of dynamite that Vinny has acquired to a safe house. Did any alarm bells go off when you're riding with a trunk full of dynamite?
Oh, yeah. So that was the really big turning point for me. That's when I left the group, because I got in this car with somebody I didn't know. I did know Vinny, but they had another young man, Eddie, who I thought right away was kind of slippery, and I didn't trust him. Got in the car. They'd asked me to drive. When I got in the car, this other guy, Eddie, was driving, and he said, "No, I'll start out and you pick it up later, because it's like a 9-hour drive." And within an hour, he was pulling out some pills, some booze, some beers, smoking a joint, and I was like, okay, now I get it. These guys are as intent on killing themselves as anybody else, and me too. And what really is the motivation here? And,
Yeah.
and what are people really motivated by? And so,
And so
anyway,
you
I had to really take stock at that juncture.
Okay, and so it's at the safe house where you take the dynamite that you tell them that you're leaving, you're cutting ties
Yeah.
with the group. In the following years, you go back to nursing school, you move to Manhattan, you do some community work, and over the following years, you read news reports about bombings and robberies that you suspected your former friends were responsible for. You would see you saw their pictures in wanted posters in the post office. What were your feelings when you saw these posters and when you read about what they were doing?
I had a lot of aversion at that point to having anything to do with that part of my life. I think I was had some post-traumatic stress or something. I really didn't want to know. I felt like if I went back even a little bit, that I would get drawn back in. I didn't trust myself not to get drawn back in again in some ways. So I really shut it out. I did that until I got called to testify.
Okay, so it's 10 years after you left the group that a number of the members of the group are arrested, and while you're pregnant, you've gotten married, you're pregnant now, you're called to testify before a grand jury it was a conspiracy trial of Roland, Roanne, Devin, and Sarah, and you do testify. And well, the conspiracy charges are thrown out, right?
Yes.
But they were convicted of other crimes and they got long prison terms.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because you were implicated in a number of criminal actions,
Yeah.
and yet you were never charged with any of these crimes. Why do you think you were never charged? Do you think that it had something to do with your family background, upper class privilege? What do you think?
Absolutely. I'm sure. I don't know for a fact that that was true, because my father was dying of cancer at the time, and I never asked him, did you get the judge in Portland to, drop these? Because there was an indictment and a heavy sentence for me if at that. I was never indicted, but there was anyway, there were charges that I knew were pending against me. So, and so I assume at this juncture in my life that that's what happened. That there was some way that he pressured them. I don't know if pressured is even the right word. Okay, I'd left the group. I'd gone on with a life. I'd gone back to nursing school. I wasn't involved with the group anymore.
Right.
So let's just, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a feeling that, unfortunately, that's often the case.
Is often the case.
Yeah.
You've since worked as a nurse practitioner. You found a free alternative health clinic. You're an ordained Buddhist monk. You've mentored women in prison. You're a mother. How did your association with these revolutionaries change your life?
I feel like all those experiences have taken me to exactly where I am today. In some ways, they've really been, I had to sit and stare at a wall for an awful long time to let some of this stuff settle down. But I feel it's brought me be very wary of what people's motivations are who claim to be leaders. And so you need to be cautious and be a light unto yourself in many ways. I think I was constantly turning my power, my voice over to let other people speak for me. And I think all of us know, really, we have some way of knowing if we get still enough that what is the right thing for us to do. So. I really enjoy in Zen Peacemaker's order, they have these tenets where you go into the space in your heart of not knowing the answer and bearing witness to what's in front of you and then coming up with an appropriate action from there. So for me, just finding that still spot as best I can allows me to find a heart that doesn't really want to harm anyone, but understands that there's a lot to change, but by violence is not my way.
My thanks to Linda Coleman for joining me. Radical Dissent, The Cultivation of an American Revolutionary has just been published by the Pushcart Press imprint of W.W. Norton Company. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.